Hey everybody, it is in fact your boy Jaimas, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit special. If there is one game I happen to know better than basically any other game I frequently play, and isn't Infernax, it's probably Resident Evil. I have done more than simply play this game. I have done speedruns, my best time is 1 hour and 43 minutes. I've done meticulous breakdowns on the ins and outs of the various versions of the game, and so on. And RE1 is replete with little secrets if you go looking for them. But I decided, you know what? I might as well share with you the biggest one. The one almost nobody knows about. And that one is the entire secondary way to meet Rebecca in the game. Now, normally, during Chris's scenario, you run into Rebecca for the first time on the first floor storeroom on the west side of the mansion. However, there is also a secondary, much different way to run into Rebecca in Chris's scenario. Most players didn't know about this method until the Deadly Silence port of Resident Evil. The reason why is that Deadly Silence's arranged version is set up in such a way where this is the only way you can run into Rebecca. But this method, it was always in the game. It's just a matter of making it happen because it's obscure and counterintuitive. Now, because of how this particular section rolls, you are going to see me using the knife to take down the zombies a lot. This is not due to a need for me to flex or anything. This is just because it's better to get them out of the way. Speedrunners could probably jank the whole thing. We are currently playing this on the PC port of Resident Evil 1, which is basically identical to the original port on PlayStation, except it's completely uncensored and in a slightly higher resolution. And yes, this trick that I am going to be showing you will work on every single source port version of the game. It will work on the PlayStation version, it will work on the Director's Cut version, it will work on the Director's Cut version with DualShock and the terrible music, it will work on the second generation DualShock version, which had the original music, it will work on all versions from PSN, and it will also work on Deadly Silence. The only requirements are that A, you're playing as Chris, and B, you do basically what I'm going to be showing you in this little video. It will also work irrespective of mode. So you can be playing this on the easy difficulty on the Director's Cut ports, and it will work. Or you can be playing in arranged mode on the Director's Cut ports, and again, it will work. All you have to do to trigger this alternate meeting with Rebecca is get to Richard. Specifically, get to Richard without ever meeting Rebecca. Now, Resident Evil 1 has a lot of weird scripting that can happen during the game that changes up the events a little bit depending on what you do. This is one of the only ones I'm aware of in Chris's scenario. It's also completely counterintuitive if you're playing on the original map layout. The normal progression in Resident Evil 1's Chris scenario, at least on classic mode, funnels you towards the first floor western storeroom. The reason why is that you need the sword key to unlock the bulk of the first floor eastern wing. That key, in classic mode, is in Rebecca's room. And because Rebecca's room has an item box, which will have 2 handgun magazines in it, it's a trifecta. Meet with Rebecca, get a quest item, get extra ammo. Getting the alternate meeting with her essentially requires you to ignore that her room is there. Now, it goes without saying that this is not what you should be doing if you're trying to speedrun. This adds, by my estimates, an extra 8 to 9 minutes worth of gameplay to your save. Possibly a bit more than that if you are also counting how much you're going to have to run around as Rebecca at some point. What it does get you is early access to the radio, allowing you to hear several conversations you otherwise wouldn't be able to, and some minor dialogue and scenario changes going forward. But we'll get into those when we actually get there. For now, allow Grandpa Jaimas to give you Zen and the art of knifing. The knife in Resident Evil 1 is extremely hard to use. As a general rule, you don't want to get anywhere near the enemies in this game, especially when you have a weapon that has some hit detection issues like this thing does. That said, even in the original, the knife is very useful once you've mastered it. No joke or exaggeration, I can take down almost any enemy in this game with nothing but the handgun and the knife. It's one of the reasons I actually love the Deadly Silence port so much. Deadly Silence completely removes the knife from your inventory, and instead, you always have it, no inventory space needed. You use it with the L button. It's great. You always have it, and it's such a simple change, but it completely changes how RE1 plays. Let me give a good example. The dogs in the game are kind of an annoying enemy, but they're very easy to take care of once you know how. 1 pistol bullet to knock them down, run over, stab. Run to where the stab knocked them down, stab them again, and repeat until the dog is no longer a problem. This method works in all of the ports of the original game, But in all the others, the knife takes up a slot, and also you have to swap to it in the menu. And since Chris is generally going to be the one using the knife a lot more, since he has less available weapons than Jill does, he's the one who has to deal with that on top of the already smaller inventory. That said, here's how to use the knife in the originals. When using the knife, Chris has a very distinctive swing arc. So does Jill. Take note of how the character swings and turn slightly accordingly. For Chris, this means turn slightly to the left because his swing arc is on the right side. On the right side, the knife has a slightly longer hitbox. With good timing, this will allow you to strike enemies slightly earlier, giving you just enough time to bring them down before they can get within grab or vomit range. It's worth noting that in Resident Evil 1, the enemies are scripted to only use certain attacks at certain times. Generally, a zombie will always try to puke on you or always try to grab you. However, there's exceptions to this. If you have a zombie, for example, that is trying to puke on you, and you destroy its legs or you knock it down, it can potentially go for the last-ditch leg grab, and that is a way it can use that. If you get higher or lower than a zombie, mostly by climbing up something or onto something, it will continue to try to attack you with vomit regardless of what it was originally scripted to do. Just a very, very interesting quirk of how the enemy AI works. It's actually funny because you can save an enormous amount of ammo in Resident Evil 1 by becoming proficient with the knife. I remember during one run, I mostly was knifing and running from things while at the same time actively picking up every handgun magazine I could. And by the time I made it to the guardhouse, roughly the halfway point of the game, I was at the ammo cap for handgun bullets, 255. Right now, we're going to make a little detour and we're going to visit Forrest without triggering his cutscene. The reason why is because we're going to need that extra handgun magazine. This trick is unique to classic mode, but if you back up towards Forrest, you'll be able to pick up the item without triggering his cutscene, and ergo without triggering the crow ambush. During Arrange mode, in any of the Director's Cut versions, or in Deadly Silence, Forrest will animate and immediately start going after you. He's actually pretty dangerous because he actually does significantly more damage than your average zombie. Director's Cut added a number of zombies with variant stats, most notably a few that are really, really fast, and some that do more damage. This is on top of the variant zombies you encounter late game in the laboratory, which can also have the same stat modifiers in Director's Cut. Speaking of stats, did you know that there's actually a gigantic difference between Jill and Chris? It's more than Jill having 8 item slots while Chris has 6 in access to the lockpick. Chris can take over twice the punishment that Jill can. He also aims, auto-aims, and reloads much faster. He also suffers less recoil and fires quicker, which means if you've got the proper equipment, Chris is much better for direct combat. We are well on our way towards getting the armor key now. We just gotta go downstairs, pick up the herbicide, and bring it all the way back to the greenhouse. I kind of wonder who the very first person to find this was, because it sure as hell wasn't me. I found it in 1999 when I was playing through Director's Cut for the umpteenth time. And I was thinking to myself, hey, I wonder if I get there early enough in Chris's scenario if Richard will still be alive. And while I had intended that mostly as a joke, because this is the era when we used to hear things about how, like, you could get Mew by moving the pickup truck in Pokemon, my theory sort of turned out to be accurate. All it required was that you do things in a completely nonsensical way. Relatedly, there's a reason I've been killing every single zombie we come across. It's because we actually have to head through this area multiple times. Not just for the sake of getting the herbicide and then subsequently getting the armor key, but also to clear the way for something that happens immediately after we successfully pull this little conversation off. One nice thing is that while we do have to go to the eastern storeroom on the first floor in order to get the herbicide, while we're there, we can also use the item box and get the 2 handgun magazines that are there. That will make it a bit easier to come back and deal with the things after what we're going to do. I am really getting sick of knifing everything. Actually, for all those original Resident Evil veterans out there, have you ever noticed how bad Richard's audio is mixed? His is the only voice in the game like that. It struggles to barely be audible over the music. Director's Cut didn't fix it either. The only 2 versions of the game that have fixed it are the DualShock version of Director's Cut, which has the terrible orchestral soundtrack, and Deadly Silence. Though that does actually remind me of an interesting little point. Now, I don't know how true this is, but supposedly, Sumuragachi doing the soundtrack for Resident Evil Director's Cut, specifically the DualShock version, is actually what led to him being exposed as a fraud. See, when he got the job, he'd been kind of fostering a reputation as the Japanese Beethoven, complete with being deaf and also a brilliant composer. In reality, he was a complete fraud, basically blue-petering his compositions on the side. The story goes that by the time he was working on Resident Evil DualShock, his staff was kind of getting sick of his shit. And so at this point, one of his staffers decided to stick it to him. One of the most intimidating songs in the original Resident Evil soundtrack is a song called Narrow and Close. It's specifically played in the basement area, and it's extremely tense. The song itself is just this orchestral blare of, "You do not want to be down here." Sumuragachi's replacement for this song was originally going to be a much slower-paced, ominous song with strings. However, some hero intern decided to change the orchestration of it, and instead replaced them with horns. The end result of all this is the DualShock version of Narrow and Close, or as it's jokingly referred to by the Resident Evil community, clowns farting in the basement. Now, the greatest part of this is that the intern basically got away with it, because Sumuragachi had been faking being deaf, so he doesn't know that the instrumentation was changed until the game gets released. And while there are a few great songs on the DualShock soundtrack, everyone remembers clowns farting in the basement, because it completely undercuts and eviscerates the tension of literally the most intimidating area in the game. That hero intern, bless whoever they were, delivered a laser-guided middle finger to Sumuragachi with that one. And supposedly, it led to him being increasingly questioned about his talents, until eventually Sumuragachi cracked and revealed that, yeah, he had been a fake the whole time. If that does turn out to be true, I swear that has to be the funniest thing in Resident Evil history. Interestingly, as far as I'm aware, in the remake version of Resident Evil, this alternate way of meeting up with Rebecca is the main way you meet up with her in that game, which is kind of impressive when you stop and think about it. That it gradually went from an obscure way that nobody really knew about to the main way that it happens. We are finally on our way to bring the herbicide to the greenhouse so that we can kill the plant and get the armor key. Amusingly, this is one of the best areas in the game to get herbs, since it has 3 greens and 2 reds. Did you know that the armor key is actually the single most commonly used key in the mansion? The helmet and sword keys both unlock 3 doors each, the shield key only unlocks 1 door, but the armor key unlocks 6. 3 doors on the first floor, 3 doors on the second. Because of how important the key is, during arrange modes, like the ones for Deadly Silence and Director's Cut, moving this key can actually have a dramatic effect on how the game plays out. For example, in Director's Cut's arranged version, it's right next to where Forrest is. They actually even play around with this concept a bit in the remake, since the key is acquired in a completely different way and actually unlocks even more doors. We're closing on the main event now, so while we're on the way, let's talk about something interesting and unique to the PC version. The PC version of Resident Evil adds 2 new weapons, one for Chris, one for Jill. Both of them are unlocked after beating the game, and both of them are rapid-fire weapons. However, those who are more familiar with Resident Evil's engine might note that you can't really make a rapid-fire weapon in the engine because of how the game's mechanics work. It's really easy to notice with the flamethrower, but you can do it with other weapons too. But essentially, while the enemy is in the middle of a hit animation, it can't be hit again. It's why tap-firing the flamethrower is so much more effective than just holding it down. Only one of the original hits will register, while the others just kind of pass through harmlessly. To get around this, they did something actually very clever. The new weapons cause a tiny bit of hit stun, but they do so by making the enemy cycle through its animation very, very quickly. The end result of this is a weapon that's very bad at stopping enemies from getting closer, but will slow them down with sustained fire and ultimately bring them down pretty quick. It's a very elegant way to handle a situation with a weapon that, by all accounts, the engine was never designed to handle. Anyway, it's taken us a while, but here we are. We have the armor key, and we are at the attic connecting hallway. So we just head inside, and we meet with both Richard, who is alive, and Rebecca. And I'm going to be quiet for the sake of those who have never seen this cutscene.
Who are you?
I'm Chris of Alpha Team. I've come to rescue you. Richard, what happened?
Chris, this house is too dangerous. There are terrible demons. Out!
Richard, don't talk. He seems to have been bitten by a poisonous snake, but the size of the wound is abnormally large.
It's not just a poisonous snake. It's a monster.
Richard, he needs serum, but we left it in another room.
Okay, I'll go.
Hurry, please.
I will. Wait here. I'll be back soon.
And we are now faced with a very familiar scenario to anyone who has played through this game before. We now need to run all the way to the first floor storeroom on the west side of the mansion, where we otherwise would have met Rebecca to get the serum, just like we would have in Jill's scenario. You have about 7 minutes of real time to get back to Richard with the serum. If you take too long, he dies. The one in Jill's scenario actually works the exact same way. Interestingly, the serum is one of the most unusual items in Resident Evil 1. The very first time you fight Yawn, if he lands a bite on you, it actually causes a version of the poison status you can't remove. You can use as many blue herbs as you want, it won't go away. The serum both cures it and immunizes you against it in the future. After you get the serum, Yawn can never poison you again. This actually opens up a bevy of edge case scenarios that you probably didn't ever think about, but the game actually is written to compensate for. For example, as Jill, if you fail to save Richard, you'll keep the serum item, because he's dead already when you get there. If you get poisoned during the fight with Yawn, but you still have the serum item from failing to save Richard, for example, you can use the serum item on yourself to cure the poison. If you somehow manage to take down Yawn without being poisoned in the first fight, he will be able to poison you in the second one, but his poison is weaker and you can treat it with blue herbs. The exception is that if you somehow held onto the serum up until this point, you can use it to both cure the poison and immunize yourself against it. No joke, just in Jill's scenario, there's like 10 different ways this can pan out, depending on whether or not you save Richard, whether or not you get poisoned, and whether or not you fight Yawn. Because during your first fight with him, you can ignore him, run all the way to the back, grab the crest, and run. And yes, that too has an impact on what happens, as does whether or not you get poisoned by him. It's actually really funny that, despite all of this in the remake, it's usually preferable to beat Yawn without actually taking damage from him, so that you never have to deal with any of the poison treatment. I know that in my own speedrun of the Resident Evil remake, I barely made it to the end of Chris's scenario in the time limit, and if I had been sidelined by the serum quest, I wouldn't have made it. And that's with me knowing the speedrun strat of knowing how to juke the zombies. I don't know if the remake has the same incredible amount of scripting around the serum that the original has, since the original is the one I've taken apart and put back together, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did. Part of me wonders if the creators of Resident Evil, knew what they were doing when they included so many obscure little things in it, just seeing if anybody would run into it. God knows if they did, I appreciate the hell out of them for it. This kind of thing shows a lot of care for not only the game, but for the player, and including stuff that your average person is never going to say. But people who are really obsessive will find it, and you'll be able to share a little high five with them, just between the developer and you.
Here's the serum. Is he all right?
Yes, he is. Thanks. Richard, hold on. I'll give you a shot now.
Chris, here's a radio. Take it. Richard! No!
Richard!
Rebecca! Be careful!
Richard! Richard! Are you?
Rebecca, it's very dangerous out here. Will you come with me?
I'd like to stay here a little bit longer.
Okay, Rebecca. Can you use a gun? I'll look for the others. Protect yourself.
Chris, be careful, please.
And so that's the alternate means of meeting Rebecca. What exactly did this net us? A little bit more characterization from both Rebecca and Chris. The foundation essentially laid for when you can meet Richard in the remake, where you can actually save him. It gets you Richard's radio, which you can use to pick up a couple of transmissions from Brad during the game that normally only Jill can get. It also nets you a tiny bit of extra dialogue from Rebecca throughout the entire game. I'll show you an example of that when we get to the piano bar. For the most part, from this point onwards, the game is going to proceed as if you told Rebecca to come with you. This means she will have to save you manually if you get poisoned by Yawn, and that she will have to save you from Plant 42 as well. So once again, absolutely not something you should be doing if you're speedrunning, but if you want to see absolutely everything that this game has to offer, yeah, this is kind of cool. Back before the internets, I used to do the equivalent of Let's Plays on VHS for sharing them with my friends. Capturing footage was easy as hell because usually I was directly feeding the PS1 into a VCR. The very first time I discovered this was during one of those videos. And now, I've gotten to share it with all of you. Anyway, for an example of the changed dialogue, here's Rebecca when she meets Chris at the piano bar.
It's me, Chris.
Are you all right?
Yes, I have decided not to grieve any longer. Ah, it's the Moonlight Sonata.
Can you play? Wait, what is that?
My interpretation is off a little. Chris, may I practice for a while?
See? Just relax and play.
All right.
And there you go. One tiny little addition, not really all that much, but it does change things, and there are other changes throughout the game caused by this. Anyway, see you next time.